Good afternoon. Welcome to the first Center for Process Studies seminar of fall semester 2010. I'm John Quiring, the program director at the center. Our format this afternoon is a 90-minute combination of presentation and questions and answers. Our speaker, Dr. Marjorie Suchocki, is Professor Emerita here at Claremont School of Theology. She's co-director of the Center for Process Studies. She is director of the Whitehead International Film Festival, just got back from Paris, and was formerly director of the Process and Faith program. She is author of God, Christ, Church, A Practical Guide to Process Theology, The End of Evil, A Process Eschatology in Historical Context, The Fall to Violence, Original Sin in Relational Theology, In God's Presence, Theological Reflections on Prayer, The Whispered Word, A Theology of Preaching, also Divinity and Diversity, A Christian Affirmation of Religious Pluralism. She is also co-editor with Joseph Bracken of Trinity in Process, A Relational Theology of God. Her title today is Prayer in Troubling Times, A Process Perspective. Will you welcome Dr. Marjorie Suchocki?
Feels strange to be back in this space after retiring so many, many decades ago. Well, years actually. My title, as you heard, is Prayer in Troubling Times. The Bible knows a good deal about prayer in troubling times. Just remember that ancient book of Habakkuk, not often in our lectionaries, where the prophet stands in agonizing anticipation as he watches the hordes come down to sack his beloved Jerusalem. Now, usually the Jewish people responded to disasters by asking what they had done wrong, that such calamity should come upon them. And Habakkuk continues this tradition. And then suddenly he notices what's wrong. The marauding hordes, presumably coming at the command of God to punish Israel for its sins, are even greater sinners. Who's punishing whom? And prayer then takes the form of, what's going on here? If I hold this, is it better this way? All right, so I'll hold it. But we didn't go all the way back to a Hebrew prophet to suggest that the problem with prayer in troubling times. And I will give you 3 illustrations, one personal, one national, and one global. If you want more, we can probably think some up, that have problematized prayer for me in these days. Now, the first might actually annoy you just a little bit. Why on earth should one worry about a squirrel getting eaten by a hawk? But truthfully, I had more than one long argument with God about this very thing, so let me explain. My daughter Kathy was out cleaning her pool in her Texas home when she heard a plop behind her. And there it was, this little few-inch long, scrawny, blind, hairless critter that she knew at once was a baby squirrel. The nest up above had been torn to pieces, and there was no way to return him to his erstwhile home. Now, being a tender woman, my daughter, of course, being a tender woman, she took the squirrel in, and she checked that all-knowing wizard, the internet, and learned how to care for the little thing. And care she did. She gave him tummy rubs. He'd have rubbed up against his siblings in the nest, she said. And she fed him puppy formula. And my grandson named him Pope Squirlington. And the little Pope thrived under Kathy's care. He opened his eyes, he grew hair, he became frisky, and he lived happily in the spare room, sleeping in a basket lined with rags inside a cage whose door was always open. But the internet warned, squirrels are not pets. They do not tame. They must live in the wild. Truly, they could live a miserable existence for maybe 12 years in captivity, and perhaps only 2 in the wild. But squirrels need the great outdoors once they reach the age of 12 weeks. And truly, it was clear that the spare room was not the place for an energetic squirrel who was literally climbing the walls. So when 12 weeks came, in some trepidation, but wanting the best for this little creature, Kathy put a nail in the side of her house by their upstairs bedroom window, hung the Pope's nest on the nail, and then built a shelf by the window, fastening a long branch from the shelf to the bush below. It took Pope just 2 days to discover his highway to the bushes. I watched him frolic from branch to branch, a glossy little bundle of energy, seemingly overjoyed to be experiencing a natural habitat. And soon he discovered the bamboo forest just behind Kathy's yard. But come twilight, he'd be back on his shelf, looking for his tummy rubs and his almonds and his night inside his nest. As the months went by, he would always answer to his name when anyone called him, gazing brightly with tilted head, and he'd take his tasty almonds from anyone at all. But only Kathy was allowed to give him the tummy rubs. And indeed, the Pope would turn over in her hand, golden belly up, waiting for his tummy rub each night. What I can barely convey in this little story is how much Kathy loved this little creature, this wild piece of nature who responded so quickly to her touch. As the fall nights grew cold, she bought a warm baby blanket lining his basket nest. And Pope was glossy and frisky, a healthy, half-tame, half-wild little thing. Then in early November, he did not come home for the night. And the next day, Kathy saw the hawk circling the bamboo forest, and she never saw the Pope again. Now, I told you, you might think that my tale of the ways of nature a rather minor worry in the world, and I reckon that it is, for it is the nature of hawks to hunt for healthy little squirrels. But Kathy loved this little squirrel and grieved mightily. She's no stranger to grief. In 1989, her infant daughter died of multiple birth defects. In 1993, her husband died of leukemia. Surely the loss of a wild squirrel does not compare with these tragedies, and clearly these earlier griefs far more truly own the title of troubling times. We are marked forever by such losses. What was the death of the little Pope against such pain? Is it not just a rather benign instance of the normal losses of time? Why should I have railed at God? Because I did. It simply seemed to me that if God watches over all things, surely any self-respecting God would have led that hawk to some nameless and unloved field mouse. Or God could have warned Pope, keeping him hidden in the shadow of a mighty rock. It simply wasn't necessary that this glossy, frisky, bright-eyed, almond-loving, tummy-rubbed Pope should be bird food at the age of 8 months. 2 years maybe, but not 8 months. God, I raged, did you have to give Kathy just one more grief? Couldn't you have saved this squirrel? I know. How silly to yell at God over the death of a squirrel. Humph, I complained, noticing that Jesus says God knows when the sparrow falls, but doesn't say a thing at all about God stopping the sparrow from falling in the first place. Nonetheless, was it so very hard to spare the squirrel? I prayed. What kind of care is that? Squirrels, you might complain back to me. How can you worry about squirrels when there's so much human pain going on in the world? But that's just the point, you see. There is so much pain going on in the world, far more senseless than the death of a little squirrel. Perhaps in the enormity of the world's pain, it is easier to focus on the little pains we endure. And in questioning God about the little ones, the larger ones loom quietly like stone giants in the background. How do we pray about little personal pains, given the horror multiplied by many, many, many griefs and pains? How do we pray in troubling times, when God does not stop the fall of a sparrow, the death of a beloved squirrel, the gushing of an oil well, the bursting of a gas pipe, the horrors of rape, whether of persons, whole nations, or the environment, the agonies of torture, war, genocide, dying species, or even the planet itself? For the troubles in our nation and world are strong indeed. We are torn into bitter political polarities so that winning is more important than governing. We create trade agreements that we call free, regardless of the enslavement of poverty that they produce. And then we scream about impoverished immigrants trying to come north for jobs, any jobs, no matter how backbreaking, no matter how degrading, just so they might send money home to families to buy food. Troubles. We seem to be addicted to endless wars and endless terrorisms over endless controversies and endless ideologies. And to mention addiction certainly calls attention to the endless yen for drugs in the United States, along with our endless support for the murderous drug cartels by our endless moralizing as we refuse to put drugs in the same legal category as other addictive substances, such as nicotine and alcohol, therefore supplying the drug trade with many, many customers. We send jobs overseas where the labor is cheap. Women in Vietnam are rejoicing because their salaries making clothes for Walmart were recently increased to $44 a month. And then we agonize over the growing economic losses to formerly middle-class Americans who no longer have work. We take vindictive pleasure in long prison sentences that now roll in profits for the increasing prisons for profit industry. Oh, we live in troubling times. No matter which end of the political spectrum seems best to us, or whether neither end suits, and we struggle for a degree of sanity in some elusive middle ground. How do we pray in such times? Does one political side pray for strength and protection from the other? What sense do such conflicting prayers make? And does God, who does not seem to intervene in whatever we do, even care about the fall of these sparrows of our nation? What sense does prayer make? But of course, even as we are weighed down by these national problems, the global problems loom. We learn that warming ocean waters have decreased the production of phytoplankton by 40% in the past 40 years. And phytoplankton not only produces oxygen, but also is the primary food supply whose loss affects all species in the oceans, warming oceans. And now ships can plow that elusive Northwest Passage, the waters above Canada, between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The loss of Arctic ice not only now opens further international controversies over who gets to drill for the Arctic oil, it also means death for those species of animals and plants whose life cycles depend upon Arctic ice. Warming oceans, warming planet, and now hundreds of miles of pine forests in the Canadian and American Rockies are dead because of pine borers that no longer die in winter. It's not cold enough. And so it forces grizzlies and others who depend upon the mountain forests down into habitations already colonized by their enemies, we humans. We learn that the planet Venus, about as far from the sun as we are, once had oceans, but that now they are gone, turned into the noxious gases that shroud the planet in life-denying extremes of temperature. Are we in the process of repeating that planetary death? Richard Lovelock writes that the Earth has gone beyond the point of reversibility, that it will not be able to recover from the ills we are inflicting upon it. And so we quibble over whether or not to stop this or that many greenhouse gases fiddling away while our Rome burns. Troubling times. Never in human history have we had problems on such a global scale, so much so that the mind numbs, retreats, refusing the evidence. How do we pray in these troubling times? Can prayer do any good against our wanton willfulness? Does God stop the sparrow's fall, the warring worlds, the planet's death? And now you see, you are probably glad that I began this litany with something as small as a squirrel's death. Far easier to think about the death of a squirrel than the deaths of massive numbers of people and other living creatures through oil spills, war, famine, genocide, global warming, or the death of the planet itself. But, luckily, for those of us convinced by the cogent pragmatism of process theologies, there are ways to think about prayer and to go beyond thinking about prayer by actually engaging in prayer, even in such troubling times as these, or even and especially in such times as these. Process changes the configurations that we bring to notions of prayer. Through much of the Christian tradition, prayer has been seen primarily as either a petitioning exercise in which we ask God for the things we need or want, or a thanksgiving exercise in which we thank God for God's favor or indeed for God's very being. And the context of such asking or thinking usually assumes that God is rather like a beneficent monarch, occupied with many things but holding court, during which his subjects may make their requests. Now, I do not want to argue against petitioning or thanking God, not at all. But I do want to argue against the notion of a God out there to whom we pray, and to follow the implications of the process conception that God is pervasively present in the world. By changing the out there assumptions often brought to notions of prayer, process also changes the meaning and work of prayer and increases its importance as a resource, especially in troubling times. The fundamental argument is that God is immanent in the world as well as transcendent, or distinct from the world. As immanent, God is present to all things as a force toward intensity of experience, breadth of experience, and toward some sense of a communal good. That is, individual good is always contextualized by the good of others, which may be a short-range or a long-range view, depending upon the capacity of the becoming entity. The imminence of God is not a coercive force, demanding a narrow range of options, but a more pervasive and persuasive force, constantly present, constantly adjusting precisely what is the good according to a vast complexity of circumstances. And in such a view, prayer takes on an interesting role. It is not an attempt to coerce God into doing what one wishes. That would be to reverse the very nature of prayer, which is fundamentally to open oneself to the divine purposes in creation, both broadly and narrowly. Prayer is not bending God to our preferences in nature, but opening ourselves to the divine preferences in nature. But by opening ourselves to the divine preferences in nature, peculiar things happen. The assumption concerning this divine immanence is that God works with whatever is in the world to bring it toward that which best serves the well-being of the world. Don't you see, then, that if we open ourselves to God's nature, allowing it to inform us as much as possible, this very openness creates a qualitative change in the world with which God works. If God uses all things in the process of providing influence to all kinds of things, then prayers are a part of the resource in the world that are used by God toward what change is possible within that ongoing world. Prayers are a qualitative change in the stuff with which God works in continually influencing the world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's consider in slightly more detail this issue of transcendence and immanence. While process argues for a form of transcendence for God, a sort of there-ness, its main emphasis is on the radical immanence of God. Transcendence and immanence are like the two sides of a coin, each requiring the other, such that neither makes sense apart from the other. In this relational world in which we live, everything, by virtue of being itself, transcends all other existences. And at the same time, by virtue of being itself in a relational world, includes all aspects of all other existences that have preceded it within its own constitution. Everything is transcendent. Everything is immanent. This is so for each and every existent reality, including God. We can make such notions a little less abstract by considering our own mode of existing in the world. Each one of us is distinct, unique, so that no matter how much we may share with others, we are not reducible to those others. We are ourselves. In this sense, we each transcend all others. But in our very uniqueness, we know ourselves to be radically influenced by, informed by, shaped by others. We reflect the conscious and unconscious assumptions of our race, gender, class. We make judgments and form values that are more or less typical of our nationalities and cultures and families, no matter how we might individualize them. The opinions of our friends and relatives influence our own opinions, and especially in an academic community, the opinions, one might even hope to call it wisdom, of respected authors affects our own developing sensitivities about this or that. We transcend all others through our individuality, But we include all others as we shape our own individuality in our various contexts. It's not an either-or world of transcendence or immanence, but a both-and world of transcendence and immanence. Process thought suggests the same thing for God. God transcends all others in the distinctness of God's own nature. But God includes all others within the everlastingness of God's own nature. Process imagines that God's transcendence is God's primordial self-definition from everlasting to everlasting, and that God's immanence is twofold. It is God's immanence in the world through the graded effectiveness of God's nature, pervasively present throughout the universe. And immanence also refers to the presence of the world in God. Just as we take all sorts of influences into ourselves, integrating these influences into our own peculiar way, God takes the influences of the world into the divine self, utilizing those influences, disposing of those influences, if you will, in light of God's own character. Just as we are the final arbiter over how we deal with the influences upon us, even so, God is the final arbiter of what God does with what God receives from the world. This dual sense of transcendence and immanence applied to our notion of God suggests that the life of God is an everlastingly dynamic process of interrelationship with the universe. What we do, what anything does, what anyone does, wherever it is, whatever we do is taken into God and dealt with according to God's good pleasure. Some have argued that God's immanent effectiveness in the world more or less depends on very specific guidance given by God to each and every developing moment of existence. For myself, for arcane reasons that I probably couldn't repeat right now, I suppose that God's guidance is necessarily a bit more ambiguous than that, given the vast complexity of each and every context. But regardless of that argument, stay, if you will, with the process understanding of the togetherness of transcendence and immanence. In our own case, we can understand how the influences of others shape our lives, but by the same token, we must reckon on our own influence on the lives of others. We are not only shaped by, we also have a part in shaping all others. What we think, what we do, who we are, has an influence on the becoming of all others in the world. Others must take account, whether positively or negatively, of the difference we make to their own context. This is the basis of the radical responsibility we each have for the well-being of others, for the whole. And process suggests the same thing for God. God not only receives the influences of all within God's own nature, but God is also an influence on every reality in the world, in the depths of the world's own becoming, in the depths of the universe's own becoming. Whether that reality be a hawk, a squirrel, hidden oil rigs, gas lines, corporations, plants, people, nations, cultures, or even a planet as a whole. Holy mackerel, you might say, because you see you could. If God is immanent in all things, well then please, thank you very much. Why aren't things better than they are? Why'd that gas line blow anyhow? In a process world, the answer may seem deceptively simple. Things are what they are because of the influential context in which they exist, and because of what they become and do within that context. Everything that happens does so through a complex set of causes, and nothing is reducible to a single cause, not even the single cause of God. A process world of intense interrelationality, including God, is frankly a rather messy world. If your preference is for a more simplified cause and effect world, it's not to be found in process thought. God is an influence on what all things can become, not the cause of what all things do become. There are many influences, such as corroding metal and inattentive maintenance, not to mention possibilities of corruption and greed, all of which factor into what happens to an underground gas pipe, even though its very existence is dependent as well upon the general creative influence of God. That which God influences responds as it will to God's influence as well as to the influence of all other things upon it, becoming itself in the process. So what is prayer in this world? Prayer assumes God's pervasive presence. Prayer assumes that God's presence is toward the good. Prayer also assumes that God's pervasive experience of all perspectives gives God a far greater sense of what constitutes the good in any specific case. Given these assumptions, prayer is an intent to open oneself to God's own desire for the good, and to align oneself as much as possible toward that good, even though we can never know it precisely as God knows it. In the case of our gas line, alignment with God's care for the world could sensitize a worker or a manager to take more cognizance of the dangers of corrosion and prompt more care for the maintenance of the underground system, despite the many other competing demands on the worker's or manager's time. The function of this alignment with God's care for the world is simple in a world where God works with what is in order to persuade it toward what might be. Prayer, our openness toward God's own care for the good, simply gives God more to work with than would be the case if we were indifferent to the good. Think of it this way. God is more than the world and thus transcends the world. But God is immanent in the world through God's own influence, and the world is immanent within God, since God receives the world in every moment. When we are praying, or in any other way, opening ourselves to alignment with God's care for the good, this is what God receives into God's nature. Since God uses everything received from the world in God's own shaping of influence toward the world's manifold next becomings, our prayers, taken into God, are used by God to strengthen what is now possible in the world to be. Prayers can change the relevance of possibilities for the world. It's not that God won't act apart from our prayers. It would be impossible for God not to act. Neither is it the case that if we warm up a huge number of people, all praying for the same thing at the same time, God will be forced into doing what we demand. The ultimate determiner for what happens with our prayers is God, acting from God's own everlasting character. Remember, prayer is an intent to open ourselves and align ourselves to the divine character, not an intent to get God to do what we want. Were that the intent of our prayers, they would be a perversion of prayer, insofar as they attempt to get God to align the divine nature to our own characters and purposes, rather than the other way around. Prayers are in openness to God, given to God, and therefore no longer in our control. They are God's, to use with as is possible within the complexities of the world. Of course, one of the dangers of prayer in a process world is that God uses every nook and cranny of existence to accomplish the good, and once we open ourselves in prayer to the divine intentions, we risk God using us to answer these prayers. In fact, our prayers make us vulnerable to involvement for the things for which we pray. It's a risky thing to pray, for we may find ourselves answering these prayers, troublesome though that might be. By the grace and power of the persuasive God, God may yet use us. And in fact, for all we know, it's God who prompts us to prayer in the first place that's already influencing us in the world toward a particular form of good. Prayer in a process world is far more than the binary yes-no system of prayer in a universe where God is like some grand monarch of the world dealing benevolently with our requests and petitions. I have heard persons who pray from such a binary system say, well, God answered my prayer, God just said no. But in a process universe, we can never know exactly what God is doing with our prayers. It's a pretty sure thing that God will use us as much as is fitting in dealing responsively with our prayers, but that's probably only the surface of how God can use prayer. Since God works pervasively with all becoming systems and beings in the world, it may be that our prayers are useful to God in ways we could not have imagined. Remember, distance applies to things that exist in a particular time and space. We are separated from those we care about. Sometimes they're continents and oceans away. But God pervades all times and all spaces. There is no distance to God. Therefore, a prayer given in Southern California might be instantaneously and effectively used by God anywhere at all for situations known or unknown to us. Prayer is action at a distance. I've suggested, insisted even, that prayer is an intent for alignment with God's own character. So I'll say a bit more about that. To exist in a process world is to receive influences from all others and to integrate these influences within the self according to one's own emerging purposes. This integration within ourselves is the sense in which we transcend all other things, even as we take account of them. In the instant of our becoming, we then are, as we sometimes like to fancy, a force to contend with by every one of our successors. Excuse me. I've had a cold. I've got to take a drink of water. You will have a water break at this particular moment. I'll probably lose my place, but at least I'll be able to talk. Maybe I shouldn't. Well, that helps. Okay, where'd we go? Yeah, I was talking about being a force to contend with. To be is to have an effect in a process world, and what we make of ourselves in every moment makes a difference far beyond ourselves. All of our successes must take some account, minute or large, of the difference we make in the world. So now when you apply this kind of relational existence to God, you see how it is finally God who determines how to answer our prayers, regardless of who or how many are doing the praying. Whitehead argued that God's character is determined by God primordially. Whitehead, for various reasons, speaks of the divine everlasting character as adventure, truth, beauty, zest, peace. Religious people sometimes combine all these characteristics under the name of love. And Michael Zabarachek has argued that we should also include justice. God receives the influences of the world, and as God receives the influences, they must be filtered through God's own character in order to yield God's new calls to the world yet becoming. Our intent to align ourselves with God's character is so that the prayers we offer to God will be, as much as possible, already reflective of God's own being, and therefore more useful to God. This notion of aligning ourselves as much as possible to God's own character in our intercessory prayers for this troubled world can offer some insight into another form of prayer, confession. Alignment with God would mean that we too aim as much as possible toward truth, beauty, adventure, zest, peace, justice, love. But in fact, we are rather complicated creatures, necessarily working from limited perspectives and somewhat murky notions of the good. If prayer is an intent to be open to God's own character, then prayer also illumines those aspects of our becoming that are in direct opposition to truth, beauty, adventure, zest, peace, justice, love. Intercessory prayer can then become prayers of confession as well as intercession, as in our openness we become aware of ways we ourselves have impeded the very good for which we pray. Insofar as our attitudes and actions diminish the amount of good possible in the world, we ourselves are part of the blockage against which God must work to persuade the world toward good. And when we recognize this, naming our obstructiveness before God, we in a sense see ourselves as God sees us, and as God has had to work with us all along. This naming can illumine us, opening ourselves to change in the direction of communal as well as personal good. For example, in praying for the ecological good of our planet, we can become aware of small and great ways in which we ourselves contribute to ecological destruction. Intercessory prayer can lead to confessing prayer, which leads us back again to intercession, praying for an openness within ourselves and others that will be used by God and others toward the good for which we pray. Process thinking recognizes that our prayers to God occur within a deeply complex world and universe, where patterns upon patterns of intersecting and competing forms of existence are sometimes at cross purposes and competing forms of, and sometimes in concert, but always in webs of relationality deeper than we can fathom. Every atom of existence adds its own determinations to that which is possible for its successors in the weaving that makes up a teeming world. The role of prayer in such a complexity is to offer our influences toward the good to God, who works with them, as is possible, within the matrix we call our world. Within such an understanding, it should be apparent that prayer is much more than the words we address to God. Prayer is fundamentally an orientation toward life that yearns for the flourishing of all things. Or, in the words of that wise woman, Julian of Norwich, of medieval times, that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Prayer is the passion for justice that engages in works of justice. Prayer is political action. Prayer is prison reform. Prayer is addressing issues of poverty. Prayer is seeking well-being for all people. Prayer is reaching across the ideologies and things that divide us, seeking constructive modes of relationship, justice, and peace. Prayer is deeper than words, but it can also manifest itself in words, sometimes driven so, given the heartaches of the troubles in our world. And sometimes prayer is an irrepressible singing in gratitude and delight for so much beauty and goodness, even in the midst of pain. Prayer is finally deeper than words. It is a matter of the heart. As such, it reflects the Apostle Paul's injunction to pray without ceasing. Prayer is an orientation of one's life out of the desire for alignment in finite form with God's infinite goodness, God's infinite adventure, God's infinite zest, God's infinite peace, God's infinite beauty, God's infinite justice, God's infinite love. As such, prayer becomes a reflection back to God, a sort of image of God in the reverse, in the yearning that life as we live it shall incarnate, to whatever degree possible, the divine goodness here in our complex histories. In and through such praying, greater communities of well-being can become actual as well as possible within our world, within our histories. Sparrows fall. Hawks eat squirrels. Loved friends contract dreaded diseases and die. Nations and persons become consumed by greed. Personal and national desires overcome personal and corporate responsibility for the health of our planet. Peoples war with each other, each with the intent to fatally wound the other. All together yield troubling times. And it must be the case that every generation, perceiving with horror the troubles of its own time, reels under the conviction that it has never been worse. Charles Dickens is among my favorite authors, and it's he who said, "It was the best of times and the worst of times." And perhaps this is always the case. In the midst of troubles, we nonetheless experience the wonder of love, friendship, beauty, adventure, zest, truth, justice, peace. We live in a both-and world. And in this both-and world, then, we give thanks for gladness for the elements of adventure, truth, zest, beauty, peace, justice, love that pervade existence, glad that we can count on a God whose pervasively present influences toward the infinite forms and finite forms of precisely these things. At the same time, we feel with a heavy heart the pressing needs peculiar to our own troubling times, not neglecting our own part in contributing to these sorrowful times and griefs. In doing so, we offer our openness to alignment with God's own character, not only in worded prayers of intercession, confession, gratitude, but in the deeper reality of hearts yearning for the good. We release these prayers, and indeed we release ourselves to God, for God to use as God can. And in doing so, we also look for the ways God might use us in partial answer to such prayers. Will all the problems we name go away because we pray? Because God uses our prayers? No, of course not. The world is too complex for that. But we pray in confidence that our prayers make a difference, ameliorating the conditions for which we pray. The confidence stems from our awareness of the forms of truth, beauty, adventure, zest, peace, justice, and love that are interwoven with all life, and our profound conviction that these qualities are reflections of the very nature of the God to whom we pray. And so we pray, even and especially in troubling times.